if you offer Bill Self red pill, blue pill, the red pill, you win a game 90-88. The blue pill, you win a game 54-40. He's taking the blue pill every time. He's taking that every time. Every time he's taking that. So I'm sure he absolutely loved it.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible.
Paid all who enter, and beware this podcast. That's right, this is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. As always, I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible. Member FDIC. Be sure to go out and support them as they support us here on the show and on the Kansas City Sports Network at large. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like the show. You can subscribe to the channel and also drop a comment to share your thoughts. We're getting closer to 500 subscribers, so thanks so much if you have done that already. And you can head over there to Kansas Jayhawks KCSN on YouTube for additional content. Of course, if you're listening on the audio platforms, you can always subscribe wherever you get your show as well. And leave us a 5-star rating and review also. And tell your friends, tell your family, tell whoever you want about us here on the show, talking all things KU. Let's dive into it, Kevin, as Kansas basketball gets another win, this time on the road against Cincinnati. We talked about it ahead of the game with Cincinnati being certainly a defensively focused team, maybe a little bit offensively impaired at times. That really came to be true in this one. Kansas wins 54-40. And with about 5 minutes left, it was still like a single-digit game. And similarly to the Arizona State game, the game before, I was sitting there thinking, man, there's like 6 minutes left and Kansas is only up like 7, but this thing is over. Like Cincinnati cannot score, and they didn't score, and Kansas holds them almost under 40 points, but they didn't do it. What was your immediate takeaways from what ended up being a fairly comfortable win for Kansas on the road?
Yeah, at 14 points, you realize it's the closest game by margin that KU has played since Shaq Moore entered the starting lineup. So, I mean, Kansas has been putting it on people, at least by the final score margin. And, Nick, they've really shown an ability to ramp up that defense in the second half. And to your point about the comparison with the Arizona State game, Arizona State scored 13 points in the second half. In this one, Cincinnati scores 15. Over 40 minutes, a full game's worth of the last two second halves, Kansas is allowed 28 points. And so it's kind of funny. I told this story online. I still remember at 2017 Champions Classic, I was there and covering it, and Kansas wound up beating Kentucky, if you remember. It was the team with Devontae Graham, Malik Newman, Svi, all those guys. We all knew they could shoot the ball, right? Like the offense was not going to be an issue with that team. They did not shoot the ball well in that one. I think they shot around 28% from three. And the reason I bring that up is after the game, after he did his press conference and everything, Bill Self a lot of times will talk to reporters in the hallway. And he might have been, whistling the tune to Good Times, because Bill Self was excited. And one of the things that, I don't remember him putting it exactly like this, but it was kind of like, look, like this team is going to be able to score. He's like, I didn't know if we could win a close game against a good team if we didn't shoot well. And I think that that's something that Bill Self looks for is when everything else is just mucked up and you can't make shots, can you find a way to win? Because in the NCAA tournament, you don't make outside shots for 6 straight games. It just does not happen. And so you have to have another gear and you have to have another way to win. It was kind of funny. ESPN, the day after Champions Classic, ranked the 4 Champions Classic teams. Even though KU won, they put KU in last of the 4 teams, on the thought line of how Kentucky's young, Kentucky will get better, so on and so forth. End of the year in the Final Four, KU is the only one of those teams in the Final Four, and KU beat another Champions Classic team in Duke to get there. So my point with all of that, and it was a really long-winded way to put it, is that it wasn't the most pleasant game to watch. Obviously you'd like to make shots, and when the other team is as offensively impaired as you put it, as Cincinnati is, you'd love to just run away with that thing and win like 70-40. You're not always going to make shots, and you need to have that extra gear built in and the ability to win. I thought, did you see Self's comments about the pig basically afterwards? There's that saying basically that you don't want to get into a wrestling fight, with a pig. You wind up dirty and the pig is happy, basically. And Self said, we want to be more like the pig. We want to be happy to be in the mud. And he felt like this is a team that maybe is establishing that as a little bit more of an identity. I think it's good that they've established that identity or are working on that, Nick, because I still think that this is a team that is going to have times where they are going to score the ball effectively. But if that's in addition to being an elite defensive team that's going to muck things up and whatever else, that's, I think, the path for this to become sort of a national title contender.
Yeah, and look, ESPN Plus did a post-game interview with Hunter Dickinson. If you happen to watch that, Hunter Dickinson made a comment basically saying, hey, look, if we're not playing well, we want to make the other team play worse, right? And that's essentially what they did. And Bill Self has echoed that sentiment in various forms and phrases as well, in that, hey, look, you're going to have games where you're not going to play your A game, right? Like you might play a C+ game, but if you make your opponent play a D game, then you're probably still going to win that game, right? And that's kind of what happened against Cincinnati. And to your point about the scoring, like, look, we're not that far removed from Kansas in an offensive shootout against North Carolina, in which they won, 90-88 or whatever. And, from Bill Self's perspective, I think it really comes down to, hey, look, the more ways you can win, the better. Because, again, like you said, when it gets to March, you're not going to play 6 games that play out the exact same way, right? You're going to have games where it's going to be offense. You're going to have games where it's going to be defense. You're going to have games where it's going to be, a more fast-paced tempo, slower tempo, whatever it may be, whatever your opponent may be trying to do. And if you can win all those types of games, which now Kansas, I think, has proven that a little bit, then that's a huge positive. And then let's go back to the defense as well. Let's extrapolate that out a little bit further, Kevin. Just think about 3 of their last 4 halves of basketball. 3 out of the last 4 halves have been exceptional defense. It's been phenomenal to watch. You think about the second half against Arizona State. And then, in the first half, early Cincinnati was shooting the ball pretty well, but they didn't really get much after that. And then obviously the second half against Cincinnati was really dominant from Kansas. It was a very impressive performance. One guy from Cincinnati that I kind of wanted to touch on here was Simon Lukosius, the 3-point specialist, sort of. He had a really bad game for Cincinnati. I thought he really struggled. Ends up going 0 of 6 from 3, and he was just absolutely launching threes. It felt like at any time he got the ball, he was really struggling, and that helped Kansas a lot, certainly, as well. Dickinson, of course, does his thing, 14 and 12. Just another day at the office for him. He had a pretty solid game. Zeke Mayo ends up going 1 of 6 from 3. Kansas as a team, by the way, Kevin, 2 of 21 from 3.
Yep.
So that's an even more.
They went 0 for 12 in the second half.
Yep.
I think they got 1 or 2, maybe 3 free throws in the half, whatever it was, and wound up pulling away for a win where they actually trailed at halftime. And it's funny because they actually executed, I thought, extremely well offensively down the stretch, and they found some things. They were able to connect on some floaters, but they were doing a really good job at getting guys off the screen, and getting them to kind of curl around in a way that they were getting downhill with some momentum and creating some things there. And so, I thought they executed really well offensively down the stretch, not for the whole game, obviously, but for that stretch, it almost seemed inevitable, right? Like, I mean, in terms of, Kansas was really expressing its will in that one. To your point about the offense, I think Duke has the number 2 defense on KenPom in the country. Kansas scored 75 points against Duke. This is a team that has the pieces to be able to score, but I think we've talked about it on the show where we felt like the way that this team becomes a national title contender was always going to be, hey, they've got to defend at a high level. That's got to be something that they really embrace. You're seeing that right now, Nick. I thought, we talked about it just before coming on. Arizona State took Baylor into overtime before ultimately falling to Baylor, and they talked to Adam Miller after that game, the Arizona State guard, and one of the things that he talked about was in the Kansas game, even though the game was close, but before Kansas kind of put his foot down at the end, like they could feel it slipping away. It felt inevitable that the result was going to happen. And I think that's something that we've seen now for a couple games, Nick, where, it feels like when Kansas is defending like that, when the other team just isn't getting good looks, even if Kansas isn't executing offensively, even if they're missing shots, even with whatever, it almost feels like it's just a matter of time before they string a few buckets together and the complexion of a game changes.
Oh, yeah, look, we talked about it. I mean, that Arizona State game, it was like a 5-point game, and there was still like 10 minutes left. And in my mind, I'm sitting there thinking, this is over. I mean, this game is done. And I felt the same way about Cincinnati, right? Cincinnati was the same way. It was still a single-digit game, later in the game, and I thought, this game is over. Like there is no way Cincinnati is going to be able to score and to come back in this game, and both ended up becoming true. And look, I think from Bill Self's perspective, I mean, this is the type of game that he loves, Kevin. I mean, he loves it, right? Like if you offer Bill Self red pill, blue pill, the red pill, you win a game 90-88. The blue pill, you win a game 54-40. He's taking the blue pill every time. He's taking that every time. Every time he's taking that. So I'm sure he absolutely loved it. And Kansas was really good. And yeah, look, I mean, obviously we spend a lot of time talking about him, but Shaq Moore continues to be phenomenal, continues to be that sort of last missing piece of the puzzle, so to speak, for Kansas defensively from an energy standpoint. And, really those things, he really, really brings a lot to the table for them. And I think maybe the sky's the limit for him potentially in his role with this team, because I think the other really impressive thing about Shaq Moore to me is that, and maybe this is something that, AJ Storr and Rylan Griffin could take note of, is Shaq Moore seems to be not only embracing his role, but loving it, right? Like he is fully bought into whatever his role is. And that clearly is reflected in, I think, Bill Self sort of anointing him to the Bill Self Circle of Trust, which I think he's definitely in there now, which is great to see.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. Trademark, by the way, which is fantastic to see. But yeah, can't say enough about what he's done in coming into the lineup for Kansas. And again, I think, he's again that type of player where you may look at the box score and think that he's not making that much of an impact, but just turn on the tape and you can tell energy, defense, hustle plays, all that stuff. He's getting it done.
Well, how many times have we seen over the last couple of years, Mello Dotson or Kobe Bryant sort of change the complexion of a game with a pick six? And obviously you don't get 6 points of basketball when you do it. But Shaq Moore the last couple games has had, steals going directly into buckets in the second half, and all of them felt like, that's a big shift right there where the other team has possession, then all of a sudden you're getting a layup or a dunk at the other end because Shaq Moore stole the ball and turned it into points. And so he's like a one-man, momentum machine. I think the other interesting thing about this game in particular with Shaq Moore, Nick, is Shaq Moore was in the closing lineup. And we talked about with Arizona State how when Kansas sort of started to take off, the group that was out there was DeJuan Harris, Zeke Mayo, and then Rylan Griffin. In this game, it was DeJuan Harris, Zeke Mayo, and Shaq Moore. And so if he's getting closing minutes in addition to starting minutes, his place in the Bill Self Circle of Trust TM is it's pretty cemented at this point. Cemented, absolutely. So yeah, great game for him. And then we talk all the time here about how people want to replace KJ Adams in the lineup. KJ Adams had 5 offensive rebounds in the second half. And when KJ is defending and playing with that kind of energy on the boards, it's tough to take him out of a game because he and Hunter Dickinson, I think, had 9 offensive rebounds between them. And if that's going on, then you're going to be generating the sort of extra possessions where it didn't necessarily help them as much yesterday because the second chance points weren't great yesterday. So they were grabbing the offensive rebound, working for a good shot, and then missing the shot. But at some point, those shots are going to fall, and those extra possessions are going to be, just manna from heaven.
Yeah, look, KJ Adams is another example of a guy who seems to have fully bought into a role that he wants to excel at with that, right? Like, a lot of attention is placed on him on the offensive end because of maybe some of what it takes away a little bit, possibly from other players on the floor when defenses play him a certain way. But if you're going to go out and just grab every offensive rebound, there you go. That's your value there on the offensive end. And then, this was just kind of a weird game. There wasn't any fouls called in the first half until like 5 minutes left. There was like 3 fouls in the first half total. So it was a really fast-paced game because of that. The game took like an hour and 40 minutes, which was great. Get down, get dirty, rough it up, and then wrap it up quick.
It was a super physical game too, and they weren't like that was the crazy thing about it. I mean, the very first free throws I think came with like 30 seconds left in the half, and so it wasn't one of those games where you're watching and you're like, oh, this is a super clean game. Like obviously nobody's fouling each other. No, dudes were getting clubbed, and the rest were just kind of like looking at their watch, like, man, I got a plane to catch or whatever.
Yeah, so, I should have made it more clear that when I say there wasn't a lot of fouls called, that doesn't mean there wasn't fouls occurring. There just wasn't wasn't fouls being called.
I've always said though, like if you're an official, let them play or call it tight, but just be consistent through the whole game. Too often in college basketball, we have refs calling it really tight. And then they're like, oh, no, we're calling it too tight. And then all of a sudden, teams are allowed to clothesline each other with no call. And then there are other times it goes the other way where they say, oh, my gosh, teams are clotheslining each other. We're not calling it. We're going to lose control of this game. Let's start calling touch fouls. And people start getting into foul trouble because they've been playing basically in an absolute battle up to that point, and then all of a sudden the refs are like, well, we need to start calling fouls. And so I will say they did call more fouls in the second half, Nick, but I actually thought that Sermons and crew did a pretty good job of staying at least somewhat consistent, because even though they called a few more fouls in the second half, they never got to a point where it was a major shift between the way that they called fouls.
Yeah, in case you're wondering, Doug Sermons is who Kevin is referring to, and he is the new John Higgins of the big ball. He is somehow officiating every game. You watch a game on like a Monday night, and then it's Tuesday night, and it's him again, and then it's like, how is this guy calling himself? How is he officiating every Big 12?
It's hilarious too, because he's also like John Higgins in that so many fan bases dislike him, and so you're on Twitter and it's like a Monday night, and it's like you have some people that you follow that are Baylor fans. They're like, oh great, we got Sermons today or whatever, and the next day, it's you got some Iowa State fans that are like, oh man, Sermons today, this is going to be a long day, and then the next day it's somebody else, and so. The saying basically as an official, if nobody's happy, then you're probably doing your job fairly well. But, and I don't know that that's the case this one, but at the same time, I do think that there is not a team in the Big 12 that Doug Sermon seems to favor. I think they all kind of dislike him equally. So
yeah,
credit to him for that.
Yeah, there is one question I did want to get to you about this game against Cincinnati, and then we're actually going to be talking a little bit of Iowa State coming up as well later on in the show. But I do want to take a break first. Before the break, of course, I want to tell you about Home Field Apparel, our great sponsors here on Payheed and on KCSN. You can shop homefieldapparel.com and find over 40-plus items from Kansas. I've got my Warhawk Kansas Relay shirt on. It's It's actually probably my favorite shirt, to be honest. I mean, who doesn't love just the giant Warhawk logo on it? It's pretty great. So you can find that and other items at homefieldapparel.com. You can find joggers, jackets, pullovers, sweatshirts, all of the above to help yourself stay warm during this cold winter months, and also so that you can look good if you are making the trek to Allen Fieldhouse for any games, as well as we head into the rest of conference play. So go to homefieldapparel.com. You can also find 130 other plus schools as well. If you got fans of other schools, I've got myself a Youngstown State shirt. I've also got Ball State and Western Kentucky. So I've added to my collection, and you can add to yours as well. And you can use the promo code PAYHEED24, 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. That's PAYHEED24, 15% off your first order. More Kansas basketball talk coming up next.
Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. Once again, if you are like what you are listening to, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe, drop a comment, leave a 5-star rating and review. Head over to our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. Subscribe there as we get close to 500 subscribers. And of course, drop a comment, share your thoughts as well on Kansas getting a nice win over Cincinnati. But as I said before the break, I do want to pose one question to you, Kevin, about this game.
All right.
Cincinnati is a team that at one point was in the top 20 in the country, looked like a pretty solid team, started off the season really well. Then they entered conference play. They start 0-3, now 0-4 with Kansas beating them. Is this a game where you're going to look back and say, wow, Cincinnati is actually just really bad? Or was this a good win for Kansas on the road, do you think?
It could be both. I know, that feels like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I do think that Cincinnati is a team that could rebound. The defense is there, obviously. They defend really well. I think they bought in on that end. They have the pieces to be better offensively than they are, Nick. And so I think that's one of the reasons they could do that. And two, I think, Nick, we talked about it going in. This is a team that probably was going to be pretty desperate heading into this game. And so I do think that you look at it as a big win in terms of where it comes on the schedule, right? Like right before the game that we're getting ready to talk about. You couldn't go 0-2 over that road stretch. And so you had to have this one against a desperate team to get back in. So I do think you'll look back on it being, hey, this is a big road win and a big road win that they won basically by just grit and execution down the stretch. And so I think big road win, yes. Whether Cincinnati is whether we're going to look back and say, hey, that team was really bad, that's the part that's a little bit unclear, and that I do think Cincinnati could bounce back. They've got the defense to where they can compete with a lot of people, and if Skillings and Lukosius and guys like that are hitting shots, then they can compete with a lot of different people. So I think that it's a little bit of both.
Well, the good news for Cincinnati is they get Colorado and Arizona State their next 2 games, so maybe they can pick up a few wins there if you're Cincinnati. From the Kansas perspective, I'll just say this, to kind of answer my own question, I think winning on the road in the Big 12 is just good anytime you do it. It's a big win anytime you win on the road at this point. And furthermore, kind of like you highlighted, for Kansas, the big picture still being, the Big 12 title, the regular season, and so on and so forth into the NCAA tournament, making a deep run there. By losing to West Virginia, that just means you have less margin for error on the road, right? In my head, preseason before conference play, doing the math, thinking, hey, look, 13-7 or 14-6 maybe should be good enough. And if you think about that, okay, then that means you only have to win 4 road games, really. If you win at home, which you expect to win at home if you're at Allen Fieldhouse, well, you drop the game against West Virginia. That means you got to probably find one back on the road, right? And I'm not saying that this game against Cincinnati was that, but it's obviously one in the win column for you on the road, which is nice because you're going to be heading into – go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think the other part of it, too, is with the unbalanced schedules, the teams that you only play once, you have to beat those teams. I know that sounds crazy to say, and in some cases, the one team, the team that you're playing once is like Houston or somebody like that. But in these specific cases, Nick, if you're playing West Virginia once, and let's just say Houston is playing West Virginia once, you losing to West Virginia at home, if Houston's able to beat West Virginia, that's a game that they just gained on you. And so I think, Cincinnati, if Cincinnati is a team that's going to go to Iowa State or something like that, where Iowa State feels really good about winning that game, you couldn't afford to fall behind with that game by dropping that game to Cincinnati. And so you have to keep serve at home pretty well. And like you said, if you do drop one or two at home, you kind of got to make it up on the road. But I think the other part of it is with the unbalanced schedules, when you've got, hey, this is the only time we're seeing Cincinnati this year, this is the only time you're seeing Team X this year, that adds more value to that specific game as well.
Well, and look, unfortunately, in the preseason, I thought maybe 14-6 might be good enough. But Kevin, the state of the Big 12 right now, there's the haves and then there's the have-nots. And the have-nots are really, really bad. So I don't know, teams like Houston and Iowa State, maybe Kansas and even like a Baylor I guess that's probably your top four right now, right? Those four.
Arizona is in there.
Arizona is on the come up.
We're still, I think, figuring out exactly where Arizona fits, because I think the schedule for Arizona hasn't been the early conference schedule hasn't been as bad. Everybody is going to go through stretches in this Big 12 where it's like, hey, you've got a fairly manageable part, and then all of a sudden it's like Houston, Baylor, Kansas, Arizona, coming, within like a 6-game stretch or whatever. And so I'm not saying that I don't believe in Arizona. I'm just saying that I'm interested to see once they sort of hit that spot. Is it, hey, Arizona comes out of that thing 3-1 and we're saying this is a legitimate Big 12 title contender? Is it 2-2 where you say, hey, they did pretty well considering, or is it something more like 1-3, 0-4, over a tough stretch where you're saying, okay, the easy schedule really allowed Arizona to get off on the right foot? Because those stretches can really doom a team.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, you look at, like I said, probably Houston, Iowa State, Kansas, Baylor, Arizona, sort of your top 5. Then you got teams like Texas Tech, and then you could throw West Virginia in there, who are like, could jump up potentially. But then, Kevin, you look at the bottom of this conference. I mean, You got Oklahoma State, terrible. Kansas State, terrible. Even Arizona State. Obviously, they went to OT against Baylor, but Arizona State, Colorado, like Utah, like there's a lot of bad teams. This isn't the Big 12 of 5 years ago where it felt like every game you had a chance to lose. I don't think
a lot of the new / semi-new teams did not get the memo. Like, guys, you got to step the basketball up. Like and not everybody's been that way. Obviously, we talked about Arizona being off to a hot start. Houston has been, obviously a terrific basketball addition. But to you other schools, you got to step that up. This is, the Big 12 right now, I think, is third on KenPom from a conference standpoint. And it's doing that while having 3 of the top 7 teams in the country on KenPom right now. But the way that KenPom does its ranking is basically what's the efficiency margin needed to finish 500 in your conference. So the bottom of the league is really dragging that thing down right now. And so that's where things need to improve for the Big 12 to keep / maintain its status as, hey, this is the best basketball league in America. Because right now, to your point, I mean, we talked about the 17-18 team earlier. The 17-18 team got swept by an Oklahoma State team that I think finished last in the conference that year in the regular season. And so you literally could lose to anybody on any given night.
Yes.
It feels a little bit less like that right now in the Big 12, where it does feel like, hey, the top is as good as it's been, in terms of having, 3 or 4 teams that are potentially Final Four worthy, et cetera. But it feels like there's just a drop off from the middle tier to the bottom tier.
Yeah. Well, one of those teams that could be in the national title contention is Kansas's next opponent. And that is Iowa State in Ames. You knew this was one of those games where you kind of circle it ahead of the season and think, okay, that's going to be a very tough game. It's always tough to play at Iowa State in Ames. They've been really, really good. You look at Iowa State as a team, Kevin, this is a team that has a lot of familiar faces that you should be used to by now if you're a Kansas fan. Guys like Taman Lipsey, Milan Momcilovic came back, unfortunately, for Kansas, as well as Curtis Jones. They do have some new faces, though, on their interior who've been actually pretty good for them also. But they've been really dominant, obviously, undefeated in conference play. Their one loss came against Auburn, who is number 1 in KenPom right now and may end up being number 1 in the country when the new rankings come out because of Tennessee losing, right?
Yeah.
So you would think Auburn's probably just going to be the number 1 team. That's the only loss that Iowa State has. They currently have the longest win streak in the country with 11 straight games. You look at what they've done to start conference play. They've handled business. They took care of Colorado on the road. They beat Baylor by 19 at home. Dominated Utah, and then they had this game against Texas Tech that was their most recent game, and that one they were down. What was it? They were down 1, I think, right late, and basically got a bunch of fouls and free throws. Ended up winning the game, and it's Texas Tech in Lubbock. So Texas Tech fans, I'm sure, not happy about that one, but that's what they did most recently, and now they're going to come back home and take on Kansas. You know about the environment that Iowa State has. It's top 3, top 2 in the conference, right? You got Allen Fieldhouse, Hilton Coliseum's right there as well. Even though I hate the Hilton Magic stuff. I think it's so dumb. No, you do not have Hilton Magic. You have Hilton officials. But actually, I shouldn't say that because we just got them talking about Doug Sermons earlier and how, whatever. But anyways, what are your thoughts on this one, Kevin? This is obviously going to be a tough game. KenPom actually has this as a 6-point loss for Kansas. In its projections. I mean, where do you go for this one?
Yeah, it's a fascinating game to your point. Iowa State's only loss came to Auburn, who is number 1 on KenPom, and that was a game that was tied in the final minute. So, I mean, they lost by 2 points. So, Iowa State's as good as anybody in the country right now. If they probably won't be number 1, to your point, Auburn probably will be. But Iowa State is every bit as good as Auburn or whoever. And so it's going to be a really tough game. The interesting thing, I think, Nick, for me is you've seen Shaq Moore as a starter, obviously the last few games. Shaq Moore also helping close the last game. I wonder if Iowa State's height is going to force Kansas to do something a little bit different. And it's not every lineup because Iowa State can go 3 guards. They're actually a very versatile lineup in terms of the ways that they can attack you. But Momcilovic, is playing the 3 right now. It's 6'8". And, when Shaq Moore is out there with Zeke Mayo and DeJuan Harris, Zeke Mayo's the tallest of the 3 at 6'4". And so there's a little bit of a difference there. And so it's who makes the other have to adjust or does self-adjust going in, saying, hey, Rylan Griffin's 6'6", he's going to have to be out there and start off this one. It's going to be a really fascinating chess match from that standpoint. I think you have 2 teams that are pretty good defensively. Iowa State's better offensively than they typically have been. And to your point about the guys down low, those guys have really kind of allowed Iowa State, I feel like, to take the next step. When you look at Joshua Jefferson at the 4, he's a guy that has done a lot of different things for him. He's a really good free throw shooter too, which has come in key in some of their close games. He's made some clutch free throws, but being 6'9", 240, that's the guy that's going to go against KJ Adams, who, may not be 6'6", and so Iowa State is probably going to have a size advantage. The other thing is Hunter Dickinson is not going to have a bulk advantage in this one to the extent that he does a lot of times, Nick, because Deshaun Jackson has been starting at the 5. He's huge. He's like he's listed 6'11", 275, and looks like he is at least every bit of that 275. But even if you manage to get him off the court, Brandon Chatfield is, playing. He actually played more minutes against Texas Tech than Jackson did, and Chatfield's 6'10", 260. So they've got 2 really big centers, so they can afford to be physical with Hunter Dickinson and body up on him and try to keep him from getting where he wants to go. Jefferson has been, I feel like, one of the best transfers in the Big 12, not necessarily in terms of, hey, this guy's scoring 20 points a game, but just being, it's funny because they play different roles, but similar to Shaq Moore in that this guy is just an absolute hand-in-glove fit for what Iowa State needed from him. And then, quite frankly, Nick, I mean, Iowa State may have the best backcourt in the country. And so when you look at those guys, like you said, Tamin Lipsey, Keyshawn Gilbert starting next to him, Curtis Jones is like the runaway Big 12 sixth man of the year right now and comes off the bench and just gets buckets. And so if we were wondering whether Kansas's defense is real or not, Kansas could defend pretty well in this one, Nick, and Iowa State still might score.
Yeah, and beyond that, you mentioned it with Iowa State. This might be a game, to me, where the lineup with Hunter Dickinson and Flory Badunga could be really effective.
Yeah.
Because I would take Flory as an athlete over any of what Iowa State could throw at him at that 4 spot with Hunter Dickinson on the floor at the same time. So I think this could be a game where that lineup could be effective. Now, that being said, we've talked about it. The issue with running that lineup is it's kind of a double-edged sword. You can't really use it that much because of a lack of depth behind those guys, right? Like, again, Flory is Hunter's backup at this point. So when they're both on the floor, that means that you can't run that lineup for maybe as long as you would hope. So I'll be very curious to see how that is managed, because I do feel like those two guys on the floor at the same time could be really, really effective in this game. Now we'll have to see how Flory handles the road environment, right? Because people forget he's a true freshman, right?
Yeah.
So he's going to have to handle that environment against Iowa State. But
he absolutely cannot have one of those like 2 fouls in 30 seconds type things.
Yes,
he just can't do it in this one.
Yeah. So I think this game has a feeling that lineup could be really impactful for Kansas, depending on how long they could utilize it. But also, maybe Bill Self in Kansas decides to lean into the speed aspect of it, right? Maybe you just say, hey, look, Shaq Moore, Zeke Mayo, and DeJuan Harris, utilize your ball handling, utilize your speed and aggressiveness on defense, and just try to, win that way. So I think there's lots of different ways KU can attack this lineup against Iowa State. Momcilovic is going to be a problem for sure. Curtis Jones is going to be a problem for sure. You mentioned him being 6th Man of the Year award runaway already. Well, how about his 27 points he had for them against, or 26 points, that he had for them against Texas Tech in the most recent game. So, yeah, this is going to pose a lot of challenges for Kansas, certainly. The positive here for KU is that if you do drop this one, you're going to get Iowa State back at Allen Fieldhouse later in the year, so you have a chance to settle the score with them. That wasn't the case. What was it? Was it last year that they did?
Last year, one game and in Ames. Not fair, Big 12. Not fair.
Yeah. So last year that wasn't the case. This year you will have a chance to get them again in Allen Fieldhouse if you can't win this one. But yeah, this is a game where obviously you expect to go in and have a shot to win. But if Kansas goes in and plays well and still doesn't win, I don't think I'll step away feeling any worse about it, right? I mean, because you are legitimately playing one of the 4 or 5 best teams in the country right now in Iowa State at this point in time. So, no shame certainly if you're able to go in and play well and maybe still don't come up with a win. But this also has a chance to be a statement win for Kansas as well. I mean, this could be the game where, hey, yeah, you lost to West Virginia to start conference play. People thought maybe you were a little bit off kilter. Well, then you go on this little run and then you cap it off by beating Iowa State in Ames. All of a sudden, then Kansas goes from being in the conversation of, hey, top 10 team to, hey, top 2 or 3 team if you go and win this game.
Yeah, Kansas wasn't favored against Duke, if you remember. And it was one of those games where I think a lot of people were kind of looking up and down the lineup and saying, man, like Kansas doesn't super match up in this one. And Kansas wound up really blitzing Duke defensively from the start of that game, established a tempo. And then even when Hunter Dickinson wound up missing the final however many minutes of that game, Kansas was able to pull out a win and to your point, really get a statement win. And one of the reasons that we had talked about, you wanted to come out of this road swing with Cincinnati and Iowa State, at least 1-1. And so winning that first one, I don't want to say you're quite like playing with house money, but you kind of are a little bit. And so, you can come out in this one and just say, hey, like, let's show everybody. And so there's some of that. AJ Storr, I'm not saying he played great, but he had a little bit of a bounce back against Cincinnati after, just a brutal showing against Arizona State, wound up playing 10 minutes. This is a game where if AJ were to have, because we've talked about it before, he had 11 against Duke and was a key player in that game. This is a game where AJ can kind of make a case that, hey, I should be playing more, or people have been wanting him to take that next step. You come in and you play against Milan, and obviously the height advantage, et cetera, isn't as big between those two. If you're able to take him off the dribble and do some things where, you can get 8 or 11 points and really spark the team, this is a chance for him to sort of make his case, I think, too. And so I think this is going to be a really tough game for Kansas to win. If Kansas does win, it would not surprise me, honestly, Nick, if we look back afterwards and say that one of the reasons they won was that they were able to get some positive minutes out of AJ Storr, even if it's not a dominant performance or whatever, just saying, hey, this guy came in for 12 minutes. He understood the assignment. He didn't mess up. He scored 8 points, whatever, and that could be a big part of the reason that Kansas is able to win this.
All right, well, let's get into it. Let's get into some game predictions here and player of the game picks as well. You and I both picked Kansas to win against Cincinnati, which they did. You and I also both picked both teams to score more points than they did. So we were way off on that. We had someone on Twitter give us a score prediction for Kansas to score almost 80. And they might still have to be playing right now if they have to try to score 80.
Empty game, yeah, exactly.
If they wanted to end up scoring 80 points. But, regardless, they got the win in Cincinnati. Okay, Kevin, game prediction for Kansas and Iowa State, and maybe a player to watch.
Yeah, I think Iowa State probably takes this one. I think they're ahead of where Kansas is right now. I think, as weird as it sounds, because obviously Kansas did return 3 starters from a year ago, I do think Kansas is still finding its way a little bit, and there are some X factors out there where you're looking at, like, Decoit's not shooting the ball super well right now. AJ Storr is still trying to find his role. And so those are questions that we'll probably have answers to either positively or negatively when Iowa State comes down Fieldhouse, but they're questions that don't have answers right now. And the flip side of that is Iowa State returned a bunch, and their transfers just kind of plugged into open spots. And so I don't know that Iowa State has question marks right now, really at all. And so I think Iowa State takes this one. I do think Kansas is going to show well. And I think that it's going to be something like, 75-71, something like that, where it's a relatively close game. I do like Iowa State to win it. As far as X factors, we usually only name one, but I think it's the 2 guys I just mentioned, in that I think whether Diggy Coit makes a shot or two, when he comes in, he's going to shoot the ball. And so, is that he had a couple chances, I feel like, in that Cincinnati game to blow it wide open. And I think that if he makes those shots against Iowa State, that could be a reason that they win. Same thing with AJ Storr and the things we just talked about. And so it's kind of combination AJ Storr, Diggy Coit, in terms of, does Kansas get some production that, quite frankly, the last couple games they haven't been able to count on. And I think that's sort of my X factor. How about you?
Yeah, look, there was something to be said about not being a finished product in January versus in March, right? Like, you don't really want to be playing your best in, November, December, January, right? You want to be playing your best in March. And I think, to your point, it's pretty clear that Kansas, is growing more towards what they want to be, but probably isn't there yet, right? In terms of where their ceiling is and what they could be playing at come March. And that's not a bad thing at all. Like, that's not a bad thing at all, really. Whereas with Iowa State, it does feel like they are maybe a bit more finished right now, which again, that could end up biting them later on because it's just going to give teams more time to understand and scout and know what you're doing and know what you're about. So, it kind of goes both ways. It's kind of two sides of a coin there. In this game, I think I'm probably going to have to go Iowa State also. I mean, I don't know. I kind of want to just pick Kansas just for the fun of it, but I'll go Iowa State.
Roll with it.
You know what? Give me Kansas. I'll pick Kansas.
There you go.
I'll pick Kansas. I'll say 68-64 Kansas. And I think the X Factor, I'll steal a page out of your book here, Kevin. I'll go with two different guys here for the X Factors.
All right.
I'm going to go with the combination of KJ Adams and Floyd Badunga because to me, looking at this matchup, I mentioned it earlier, I do think that there's an opportunity for Kansas to maybe capitalize with Flory on the floor at the same time as Hunter. But I think also that means that whenever that's not the case, that KJ Adams is going to have to really, really step up and have a really, really strong game, continue to rebound the ball very well because he's going to be giving up size too, regardless of what his matchup is more than likely. So I think he's going to be critical for his rebounding. I think Flory is going to be critical matched up with Hunter at the same time on the floor to try to create opportunities for both of those guys. And that to me, I think is probably going to be a difference because I look at the guard spot and I think Lipsy and Harris can kind of cancel each other out.
Yeah.
I think with Zeke Mayo and Keyshawn Gilbert, they can kind of cancel each other out maybe. Now, where Iowa State maybe does tip the scales a bit is with Curtis Jones off the bench, like you said. But so if that's just kind of more a wash, if anything, and then you throw in Shaq Moore as well, that means I think Kansas has to win on the interior and with their rebounding with Hunter and Flory at the same time or with KJ Adams as well. So those are my X factors that I'll go with for this game against Iowa State. So this is the first time we differ on our picks. I've got Kansas. You've gone with Iowa State. Should be a fun one in Ames on a Wednesday night. I'm sure Hilton Coliseum is going to be electric. There's nothing else to do in Ames, so I'm sure they're all going to be there because Ames sucks and there's nothing else there. It's just nothing. So there's that. I'm sure everyone there is going to be at the game. So should be a lot of fun for Kansas. And of course, for KU, they turn around and will take on K-State coming up next weekend as well. So that'll be something to look forward to. Also, of course, K-State is they're really bad. So keep that in mind. But that's about going to do it for this episode of the Paid Podcast. Kevin, you got anything else? Any more wise insights you want to share with us before we get out of here?
It's funny. We to your point about Kansas not being a finished product. At Big 12 Media Days a few years ago, I was talking to Chris Beard. I think he was actually still at Texas Tech at the time. And one of the things that we were having a conversation about was he was basically saying that when players get better offensively, when they take jumps as scorers, it's not usually because of a giant increase in skill where a guy all of a sudden becomes a great ball handler or in the offseason he becomes a better shooter. He said the biggest gain that you usually see is people just understanding where their points come from, right? Where if you're coming off a screen, 2 steps to the left, I've got an open jump shot. Or, hey, I can get this floater when I want to get this floater, or what, understanding where your open looks and where your points are coming from. And all of that is a really long way to say, to your point about KU being an unfinished product, I think that's an area where Kansas can really grow, where Kansas is starting to understand maybe a little bit better, hey, this is where our points are coming from, because Kansas still does have possessions where you say, hey, that was a bad possession. That's a shot. The KJ Adams elbow jumper is not necessarily the shot that you want to end a possession with. And so I do think that there's a little bit of a process right now where guys are working through and sort of discovering, okay, this is where our points come from. And I think that once they do that as a team, you're going to see sort of that next step up to go with the defense, where you saw it later in the second half against Cincinnati. Like I said, there's that stretch there where they actually executed offensively extremely well and were able to pull away. I think that's sort of the next phase, if you will, with this team, is just understanding, heading down the court, hey, this is how we get Hunter the ball where he wants to get the ball. This is where we can get Rylan Griffin an open three-pointer. This is how we can get, Zeke with the ball coming off of a screen and a chance where he can either take a shot or get downhill. And I think that once those things, they establish a little more comfort level with it, I think that that's kind of the next step that they'll take forward. And when they do take that step, Nick, I do think that this is a team that is going to start living up to maybe some of the expectations that people had for them before the season started.
He is Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. Kansas takes on Iowa State on Wednesday night. Of course, you can subscribe to our channel on YouTube at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. You can subscribe on wherever you get your audio as well, on Apple or Spotify. Leave a 5-star rating and review. Drop a comment, subscribe, drop a like as well. You can also follow us on Twitter. Kevin is at KFlaherty KCSN. I'm at NickSpringer29. Follow our Payheed Twitter account, which is at Payheed KCSN as well on Twitter as well, for more updates and to stay locked in on all things happening around Kansas basketball and more. As we'll talk more Kansas football at some point.
Yeah.
With the transfer portal continuing to start to wrap up here in the spring, and then of course spring football as well. So definitely want to stay tuned here on KCSN. Thanks so much for listening once again. Stay safe out there. Stay warm. It's a little bit cold. And until next time, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.